Marcus sat in the corporate boardroom, watching the familiar ritual unfold before him. The quarterly meeting proceeded like clockwork: polished presentations, carefully crafted metrics, enthusiastic nods of approval. Everyone agreed that growth was good, success was the goal, and the company's mission was noble. But Marcus heard something else beneath the corporate symphony. He heard the hollow ring in the CEO's voice when she spoke about work-life balance, while expecting 60-hour weeks. He noticed how the marketing team celebrated authentic brand connection while manipulating psychological triggers to drive consumption. He felt the weight of everyone's unspoken exhaustion, masked behind professional smiles and caffeine-fueled productivity. The others seemed content to float along in this sea of shared delusions, finding comfort in collective agreement. But Marcus couldn't stop himself from seeing through the performance. When the discussion turned to company values, something stirred within him. Here was a moment where truth mattered, where someone needed to pierce through the comfortable lies. He leaned forward, his voice cutting through the corporate speak. Aren't we just telling ourselves stories here? We talk about values while optimizing for profit above everything else. We celebrate innovation while punishing anyone who challenges the status quo. How do we reconcile what we say we believe with what we actually reward? The room fell silent. Eyes darted away. Someone cleared their throat and quickly changed the subject back to quarterly targets. Marcus felt the familiar isolation that came with speaking uncomfortable truths. Once again, he had committed the cardinal sin of thinking too deeply, questioning too much, seeing too clearly. This is the psychology of the dangerous thinker. Not dangerous in the sense of violence or destruction, but dangerous to comfort, dangerous to illusion, dangerous to the carefully constructed stories we tell ourselves to avoid confronting difficult realities. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this type of person intimately. He called them free spirits, individuals who cannot help but think beyond the boundaries that society has marked as safe. These are the minds that refuse to accept easy answers, that question fundamental assumptions others take for granted, that see through the masks people wear to hide from themselves. Nietzsche wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often and sometimes frightened, but no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself." This is the story of those who pay that price, who choose the discomfort of truth over the comfort of illusion, who think dangerously not because they want to, but because they cannot help themselves. But what creates this type of mind? What makes someone unable to accept the comfortable consensus that others find so appealing? And more importantly, what is the responsibility that comes with seeing clearly in a world that prefers blindness? Nietzsche spent his life studying this phenomenon, not from an academic distance, but from the inside. He was himself one of these dangerous thinkers, and his philosophy emerged from the psychological reality of what it means to think independently in a world that rewards conformity. The dangerous thinker, according to Nietzsche, is not someone who seeks to be different for its own sake. They are not rebels without cause or contrarians by nature. They are individuals whose minds simply cannot accept explanations that don't hold up under scrutiny, regardless of how many people believe them. Nietzsche identified several key psychological traits that define this type of thinking. Understanding these traits isn't just an academic exercise. It's essential for anyone who finds themselves seeing the world differently than those around them. The architecture of independent thought. The first characteristic Nietzsche observed in dangerous thinkers is what he called intellectual honesty. This goes far beyond simply telling the truth to others. It's the capacity to be brutally honest with yourself, even when that honesty is uncomfortable. Most people, Nietzsche observed, engage in what he called self-deception. They tell themselves stories that make their lives easier to bear, their choices easier to justify, their beliefs more palatable. These stories aren't necessarily lies in the traditional sense. They're psychological necessities that help people function in social environments. But the dangerous thinker possesses a mind that automatically questions these comforting narratives, including their own. They find themselves unable to maintain beliefs that don't align with their direct experience, regardless of how socially useful those beliefs might be. Take Marcus in our earlier example. He couldn't simply participate in the corporate ritual because his mind automatically detected the contradictions between stated values and actual behavior. This wasn't a conscious choice to be difficult. It was an automatic cognitive response to incongruence. Nietzsche understood this as both a gift and a burden. The gift is clarity, the ability to see reality more clearly than those who are blinded by wishful thinking. The burden is isolation, the inevitable distance that emerges between those who see clearly and those who prefer comfortable illusions. The second trait Nietzsche identified is what he called the questioning instinct. Dangerous thinkers don't just accept explanations because they're popular or because authorities endorse them. Their minds automatically generate follow-up questions that probe deeper into underlying assumptions. When most people hear a plausible explanation, they feel satisfied and move on. When dangerous thinkers hear the same explanation, they think, but what if that's not the whole story? What assumptions are we making here? What evidence would contradict this view? This isn't skepticism for its own sake. It's a genuine curiosity about the nature of reality that can't be satisfied with surface-level explanations. These minds are compelled to dig deeper, to understand not just what people believe, but why they believe it, and whether those beliefs hold up under examination. Nietzsche wrote, "A casual stroll through the lunatic asylum shows that faith does not prove anything." He meant that the intensity of belief, or the number of people who hold a belief, tells us nothing about its validity. Dangerous thinkers understand this intuitively. The third characteristic is perhaps the most challenging. Dangerous thinkers possess what Nietzsche called moral courage. This is the willingness to express unpopular truths even when doing so comes with social costs. Most people, even intelligent ones, practice what psychologists now call preference falsification. They publicly express beliefs they think others want to hear while privately holding different views. This social strategy makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Fitting in with the group has historically been essential for survival. But dangerous thinkers find themselves unable or unwilling to engage in this kind of social performance. When they see something clearly, they feel compelled to express that truth, even when they know it will make others uncomfortable. This isn't because they enjoy conflict or want to be difficult. It's because maintaining the gap between what they see and what they say creates an internal tension that becomes unbearable over time. Nietzsche experienced this personally. His philosophical insights often put him at odds with the academic, religious, and social communities of his time. He could have written safer, more popular philosophy, but his mind wouldn't allow him to betray what he saw as fundamental truths about human nature and society. The fourth trait Nietzsche observed is systems thinking, the ability to see connections and patterns that others miss. Dangerous thinkers don't just see individual events or phenomena in isolation. They automatically perceive how different elements relate to each other within larger systems. When Marcus heard his CEO talking about work-life balance, he didn't just hear those words in isolation. He saw the connection between those words and the company's actual policies, the broader economic pressures that shaped those policies, and the psychological mechanisms that allowed people to maintain contradictory beliefs simultaneously. This systems thinking makes dangerous thinkers valuable in some contexts. They can diagnose problems others miss and propose solutions that address root causes rather than symptoms, but it also makes them challenging companions, because they tend to see complications and contradictions in situations where others want simple answers. Nietzsche understood that this type of thinking emerged from a particular psychological foundation. Dangerous thinkers, he observed, possessed what he called strength of spirit, the emotional resilience necessary to face uncomfortable truths about reality. Most people, Nietzsche argued, don't avoid deep thinking because they're incapable of it. They avoid it because they sense, perhaps unconsciously, that thinking too deeply about certain topics would lead to insights they're not psychologically prepared to handle. Consider how many people avoid thinking seriously about death, suffering, the nature of meaning, or the foundations of their beliefs. Not because these topics are intellectually difficult, but because engaging with them seriously might require fundamental changes in how they live. Dangerous thinkers possess the psychological strength to engage with these difficult topics directly. They would rather face uncomfortable truths than live in comfortable delusions. This strength isn't necessarily innate. It can be developed, but it requires a particular kind of courage that not everyone is willing to cultivate. The social price of clarity. Nietzsche was unflinchingly honest about the social costs of dangerous thinking. He didn't romanticize the life of the independent thinker or pretend that intellectual courage comes without significant challenges. The first challenge is what Nietzsche called the loneliness of the truth teller. When you see things that others don't see, or refuse to participate in collective delusions that others find comforting, you inevitably find yourself on the outside of many social groups. This isn't because dangerous thinkers are antisocial or superior to others. It's because social cohesion often depends on shared beliefs and assumptions, and dangerous thinkers have difficulty maintaining beliefs they don't actually hold. Marcus, in our example, didn't choose to be isolated in that boardroom. His mind simply couldn't participate in the collective agreement to ignore obvious contradictions. This made him valuable in some ways. He could see problems others missed, but it also made him socially challenging. Nietzsche experienced this personally throughout his life. His philosophical insights often put him at odds with colleagues, friends, and society at large. He wrote, "All great things bring about their own destruction through an act of self-overcoming. he was referring to how honest thinking inevitably challenges the very foundations it emerges from. The second challenge is what Nietzsche called the burden of responsibility. When you see clearly, you become responsible for acting on what you see. You can't plead ignorance or claim you didn't know better. This creates a psychological weight that many people unconsciously avoid by maintaining plausible deniability about difficult truths. If you don't think too deeply about the consequences of your choices, you can't be held responsible for those consequences. But dangerous thinkers lose this psychological protection. Their clarity makes them responsible not just for their own choices, but often for speaking up when they see others making harmful decisions based on false assumptions. This responsibility can become overwhelming. Nietzsche wrote about the terrible weight of understanding. When you see clearly how many problems could be solved if people simply thought more carefully, it becomes difficult to remain passive. The third challenge is what Nietzsche called the isolation of perspective. Dangerous thinkers often find themselves seeing situations from angles that others can't or won't adopt. This makes communication difficult and relationships challenging. When Marcus pointed out the contradictions in his company's values, he wasn't trying to be difficult. He was sharing his genuine perspective. But his colleagues couldn't or wouldn't adopt that perspective, which made meaningful dialogue nearly impossible. Nietzsche understood this as an inevitable consequence of thinking independently. The more deeply you think, the more unique your perspective becomes. And the more unique your perspective becomes, the harder it is to find others who can truly understand your point of view. This doesn't mean dangerous thinkers are always right, or that their perspectives are inherently superior. It means that the process of thinking independently leads to viewpoints that are, by definition, not shared by those who think conventionally. But Nietzsche also identified what he saw as the deeper purpose behind these challenges. He believed that dangerous thinkers served an essential function in human society, even when that function was not appreciated or understood by others. The hidden purpose of dangerous thinking. Nietzsche argued that dangerous thinkers serve as what he called cultural physicians. Individuals who diagnose problems in society's thinking that others cannot or will not see. Just as physical physicians must sometimes cause discomfort in order to treat disease, cultural physicians must sometimes challenge comfortable beliefs in order to promote intellectual health. This isn't about being contrarian or difficult for its own sake. It's about the recognition that societies, like individuals, can develop blind spots and delusions that prevent them from addressing real problems effectively. Consider how many major advances in human understanding came from individuals who were willing to think dangerously, to challenge fundamental assumptions that everyone else took for granted. Galileo thought dangerously about astronomy and faced persecution for suggesting that the Earth revolved around the sun. Darwin thought dangerously about biology and revolutionized our understanding of human origins. Freud thought dangerously about psychology and revealed unconscious motivations that people preferred not to acknowledge. In each case, these thinkers faced significant social resistance because their ideas threatened comfortable beliefs that people had built their lives around. But their willingness to think beyond accepted boundaries ultimately benefited humanity. Nietzsche saw himself as part of this tradition. He wrote, "I am not a man, I am dynamite." He didn't mean this literally, but metaphorically. His ideas were designed to explode comfortable assumptions and force people to think more carefully about fundamental questions. But Nietzsche also understood that not everyone is called to this role. Society needs people who can think independently, but it also needs people who can build and maintain stable institutions based on shared beliefs. The key is recognizing the value of both types of thinking and creating space for each to contribute. The problem arises when societies become too rigid in their thinking, when they punish dangerous thinkers so severely that no one is willing to challenge questionable assumptions. This leads to what Nietzsche called cultural stagnation, the death of intellectual vitality that comes from excessive conformity. Nietzsche believed that healthy societies needed what he called intellectual tension, ongoing dialogue between conventional thinking and dangerous thinking. This tension prevents society from becoming too comfortable with its assumptions, while also preventing dangerous thinkers from becoming too disconnected from practical realities. But this requires something that Nietzsche found rare in his own time, and that remains challenging today: the intellectual humility to recognize that both conventional and dangerous thinking have legitimate roles to play. The psychology of intellectual courage. Understanding the psychology of dangerous thinkers isn't just an academic exercise. It's essential for anyone who finds themselves thinking differently from those around them, and it's valuable for understanding how to create environments where honest thinking can flourish. Nietzsche identified several key psychological qualities that enable dangerous thinking. The first is what he called intellectual independence, the ability to form judgments based on your own reasoning rather than social pressure or popular opinion. This doesn't mean ignoring other people's perspectives or thinking you're always right. It means developing the internal strength to maintain beliefs that you've arrived at through careful reasoning, even when those beliefs are unpopular. Intellectual independence requires what psychologists now call internal locus of control. The belief that your thoughts and judgments are fundamentally your own responsibility, not something determined by external forces. Most people, Nietzsche observed, have what he called external locus of belief. They believe what they're supposed to believe based on their social environment, their education, their cultural background, or their peer group. They experience their beliefs as natural and obvious, but they're actually socially constructed. Dangerous thinkers develop the psychological distance necessary to examine their own beliefs as phenomena to be understood, rather than truths to be defended. This creates the possibility of changing beliefs when evidence warrants it, rather than defending beliefs because they're personally or socially important. The second quality is what Nietzsche called tolerance for uncertainty. Dangerous thinkers are comfortable saying, "I don't know," when they don't know, and they're willing to hold beliefs provisionally rather than absolutely. Most people, Nietzsche observed, have a psychological need for certainty that makes them cling to beliefs even when evidence challenges those beliefs. The anxiety of not knowing feels worse than the comfort of believing something that might be wrong. But dangerous thinkers develop the psychological capacity to live with uncertainty. They understand that reality is complex and that their understanding is always incomplete. This allows them to revise their beliefs when new evidence emerges, rather than defending old beliefs against new information. This tolerance for uncertainty isn't the same as relativism or the belief that all perspectives are equally valid. Dangerous thinkers still make judgments and hold strong convictions, but they hold these convictions lightly enough to revise them when warranted. The third quality is what Nietzsche called emotional regulation. Dangerous thinking often leads to insights that are emotionally difficult to handle. The ability to see clearly requires the emotional strength to face uncomfortable truths about yourself, others, and the world. Many people avoid deep thinking, not because they lack intellectual capacity, but because they lack emotional resilience. Thinking seriously about mortality, meaning, suffering, or the foundations of society can be psychologically destabilizing for people who haven't developed strong emotional regulation skills. Dangerous thinkers cultivate the emotional strength necessary to engage with difficult topics directly. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally numb or detached. It means developing the capacity to feel difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by them. Nietzsche practiced this personally. His philosophical work required him to confront the collapse of traditional religious and moral certainties. This was emotionally challenging, but he developed the psychological resources necessary to work through these challenges constructively. The fourth quality is what Nietzsche called creative synthesis, the ability to generate new perspectives by combining existing ideas in novel ways. Dangerous thinkers don't just critique existing beliefs, they create new possibilities for understanding. This requires a particular kind of mental flexibility that allows you to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously and explore the tensions between them. Most people, when they encounter conflicting ideas, feel compelled to choose one and reject the others. Dangerous thinkers can tolerate these tensions long enough to discover new possibilities. Nietzsche demonstrated this in his own work. Rather than simply rejecting traditional morality, he explored what might be possible if we developed new approaches to ethics based on different assumptions about human nature and flourishing. The development of dangerous thinking. Nietzsche believed that dangerous thinking wasn't simply an innate trait that some people possessed and others lacked. While certain psychological predispositions might make independent thinking easier, he argued that intellectual courage could be developed through practice and discipline. The first step in developing dangerous thinking is what Nietzsche called self-examination. The willingness to turn the same critical thinking you apply to external phenomena toward your own beliefs and motivations. Most people are excellent at spotting flaws in other people's reasoning, while remaining blind to flaws in their own thinking. Dangerous thinking requires the psychological humility to examine your own beliefs with the same rigor you apply to beliefs you disagree with. This means asking uncomfortable questions about your own motivations. Why do you believe what you believe? What emotional or social needs do your beliefs serve? What evidence would you need to see in order to change your mind? How might you be deceiving yourself? These questions are psychologically challenging because they threaten the stability of your self-concept. But Nietzsche argued that this kind of self-examination was essential for intellectual growth. The second step is what Nietzsche called perspective taking, the ability to understand situations from multiple viewpoints, including viewpoints that conflict with your own. This isn't the same as relativism, or the belief that all perspectives are equally valid. It's the intellectual discipline of understanding other viewpoints well enough to argue for them convincingly, even when you disagree with them. This skill serves multiple functions. It prevents you from attacking straw-man versions of opposing views. It helps you identify the strongest arguments against your own positions. And it cultivates the intellectual humility necessary for genuine dialogue with people who think differently. Nietzsche practiced this throughout his philosophical work. Even when criticizing Christianity, socialism, or other philosophical systems, he took care to understand these systems from the inside before offering his critiques. The third step is what Nietzsche called experimental thinking, the willingness to explore ideas without immediately committing to them. This requires the psychological flexibility to entertain thoughts that might be wrong or even dangerous, simply to see where they lead. Most people, when they encounter a new idea, immediately evaluate it as right or wrong based on their existing beliefs. Experimental thinking requires suspending this judgment long enough to explore the idea's implications fully. This doesn't mean accepting every idea you encounter or abandoning your critical faculties. It means developing the mental discipline to explore ideas thoroughly before evaluating them, rather than rejecting ideas prematurely because they conflict with your existing beliefs. Nietzsche used this approach throughout his philosophical work. Many of his most provocative ideas emerge from asking "what if?" questions and following them to their logical conclusions, even when those conclusions challenged his own preferences. The fourth step is what Nietzsche called intellectual courage in practice, the willingness to express unpopular truths when doing so serves a constructive purpose. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of dangerous thinking because it requires not just intellectual clarity, but also social courage. It's one thing to think independently in private. It's another thing entirely to express those thoughts when doing so might result in social disapproval or professional consequences. Nietzsche recognized that not every situation calls for complete honesty. Sometimes diplomatic silence is more appropriate than confrontational truth-telling. The key is developing the judgment to know when speaking up serves a constructive purpose and when it simply creates unnecessary conflict. But Nietzsche also argued that dangerous thinkers have a responsibility to speak up when their insights could genuinely help others or prevent harm. The goal isn't to be difficult or controversial for its own sake, but to contribute to collective understanding when you have something valuable to offer. The ethics of dangerous thinking. Nietzsche understood that the ability to think dangerously came with significant ethical responsibilities. The power to see clearly brings with it the obligation to use that clarity constructively rather than destructively. The first ethical principle Nietzsche advocated was what he called constructive criticism. When dangerous thinkers identify problems in conventional thinking, they have a responsibility to offer alternatives rather than simply tearing down existing beliefs. It's easy to criticize. It's much harder to create better alternatives to the things you criticize. Nietzsche argued that genuine dangerous thinking requires both the critical capacity to identify problems and the creative capacity to envision solutions. This doesn't mean that dangerous thinkers are responsible for solving every problem they identify. But it does mean approaching criticism with a constructive spirit, rather than a purely destructive one. Nietzsche demonstrated this in his own work. While he was highly critical of traditional morality, he also spent considerable effort developing alternative approaches to ethics based on what he saw as more realistic understandings of human nature. The second ethical principle is what Nietzsche called intellectual humility. The ability to think independently can easily become a source of arrogance or superiority. Dangerous thinkers must guard against the temptation to see themselves as fundamentally superior to those who think conventionally. Nietzsche argued that intellectual arrogance actually undermines dangerous thinking by making you less likely to notice when you're wrong. If you believe you're superior to others, you're less likely to learn from them or to recognize your own blind spots. True intellectual courage requires the humility to recognize that your perspective, however carefully reasoned, is still limited and potentially flawed. This humility makes you more open to correction and more effective at genuine dialogue with others. The third principle is what Nietzsche called compassionate understanding. Dangerous thinkers must remember that most people's beliefs serve important psychological and social functions, even when those beliefs are factually incorrect. Simply exposing the flaws in other people's thinking without understanding why they hold those beliefs is usually counterproductive. It makes people defensive rather than curious, and it fails to address the underlying needs that their beliefs serve. Effective dangerous thinking requires understanding not just what people believe, but why they need to believe it. This understanding makes it possible to challenge beliefs in ways that don't threaten people's basic sense of security and identity. Nietzsche practiced this principle even when criticizing ideas he strongly disagreed with. He tried to understand the psychological and social functions that these ideas served before offering alternatives. The fourth principle is what Nietzsche called strategic wisdom, the recognition that not every situation calls for complete intellectual honesty. Sometimes other values, like kindness or social harmony, take precedence over truth-telling. This doesn't mean compromising your intellectual integrity or lying to others. It means developing the wisdom to know when and how to express difficult truths in ways that others can actually hear and benefit from. Dangerous thinking without strategic wisdom often becomes self-defeating. If you express your insights in ways that make others defensive or hostile, you're less likely to influence their thinking constructively. Living as a dangerous thinker. For those who recognize themselves in Nietzsche's description of dangerous thinkers, the question becomes, how do you live authentically while navigating a world that often doesn't welcome intellectual independence? Nietzsche's first recommendation was what he called selective authenticity. Being completely honest with yourself while being strategically honest with others. This doesn't mean being dishonest or manipulative. It means recognizing that not every social situation calls for complete disclosure of your thoughts. You can maintain your intellectual integrity while also being socially intelligent about when and how to express unpopular views. The goal is to find contexts where dangerous thinking is welcomed and valued, while maintaining appropriate social relationships in contexts where it isn't. Nietzsche practiced this himself. He expressed his most radical ideas in his philosophical writings, where they could reach people who were prepared to engage with them seriously. In his personal relationships, he was more diplomatic, sharing his views when appropriate, while also maintaining friendships with people who didn't necessarily agree with his philosophy. The second recommendation is what Nietzsche called community building, actively seeking out others who value intellectual honesty and independent thinking. Dangerous thinkers need communities where they can express their thoughts freely and receive constructive feedback. This doesn't mean creating echo chambers where everyone agrees with each other. It means finding people who value the process of honest thinking, even when they disagree about specific conclusions. These communities provide the social support necessary to maintain intellectual courage in a world that often discourages it. Nietzsche found this community primarily through correspondence with other thinkers and through his written work. Modern, dangerous thinkers have more opportunities to connect with like-minded individuals through various platforms and communities. The third recommendation is what Nietzsche called productive channeling, finding ways to use your capacity for dangerous thinking in service of constructive goals. Rather than simply criticizing existing systems, dangerous thinkers can contribute to creating better alternatives. This might mean pursuing careers where independent thinking is valued, such as research, journalism, entrepreneurship, or the arts. It might mean volunteering for causes where your ability to see problems others miss can make a genuine difference. It might mean mentoring others who are developing their own capacity for independent thinking. The key is finding ways to use your intellectual gifts in service of something larger than yourself. This provides meaning and purpose that can sustain you through the inevitable challenges of thinking differently. Nietzsche's fourth recommendation is what he called emotional resilience, developing the psychological strength necessary to handle the isolation and criticism that often accompany dangerous thinking. This requires cultivating sources of meaning and satisfaction that don't depend on social approval. It means developing strong relationships with people who appreciate your intellectual honesty, even when they don't always agree with your conclusions. It means finding ways to contribute to the world that give you a sense of purpose beyond mere intellectual satisfaction. Nietzsche struggled with this personally. His intellectual isolation took a psychological toll that contributed to his eventual mental breakdown, but he also demonstrated that it's possible to maintain intellectual courage and creativity even in the face of significant social challenges. The future of dangerous thinking. Nietzsche believed that the need for dangerous thinking would only increase as human societies became more complex and interconnected. He argued that the problems facing humanity would require unprecedented levels of intellectual honesty and creative thinking to solve. In our current era, this prediction seems remarkably prescient. We face challenges like climate change, technological disruption, political polarization, and social inequality that require us to think beyond conventional frameworks. These problems can't be solved through traditional approaches because they emerge from the limitations of traditional thinking. Dangerous thinkers, in Nietzsche's view, would play an essential role in helping humanity navigate these challenges. Their ability to question fundamental assumptions and generate creative alternatives would be crucial for developing solutions that conventional thinking cannot produce. But Nietzsche also warned about the obstacles that dangerous thinkers would face. He predicted that social institutions would become increasingly rigid, and that there would be growing pressure for intellectual conformity. He saw this not as a conspiracy, but as a natural tendency of large-scale organizations to suppress thinking that threatens their stability. This creates what Nietzsche called the paradox of progress. The very institutions that benefit from dangerous thinking also tend to suppress it. Universities, corporations, government agencies, and other large organizations need innovative thinking to remain effective, but they also need predictability and control to function efficiently. Navigating this paradox requires what Nietzsche called institutional wisdom, the ability to create structures that protect and reward dangerous thinking, while also maintaining organizational effectiveness. This is one of the great challenges facing modern societies. Nietzsche's solution was to create multiple centers of intellectual authority, rather than relying on large, centralized institutions. He advocated for what we might now call intellectual diversity, ensuring that different types of thinking are represented in positions of influence and decision-making. This doesn't mean that all perspectives are equally valid or that dangerous thinking should be privileged over conventional thinking. It means recognizing that both types of thinking serve essential functions and creating systems that can benefit from both. For individual dangerous thinkers, this suggests the importance of developing multiple skills and maintaining connections to various communities. The future will likely require people who can think independently, while also collaborating effectively with others, who can challenge conventional wisdom while also building practical solutions. The responsibility of clarity. Nietzsche's final insight about dangerous thinking concerns what he called the responsibility of clarity. When you develop the ability to see clearly, you become responsible not just for your own life, but for contributing to collective understanding in whatever ways you can. This responsibility isn't a burden imposed from outside. It emerges naturally from the recognition that clear thinking is both rare and valuable. When you possess abilities that could benefit others, you have an ethical obligation to use those abilities constructively. But this responsibility must be balanced with realistic expectations about what individual dangerous thinkers can accomplish. Nietzsche argued against what he called messianic thinking, the belief that dangerous thinkers are responsible for saving the world or solving all of humanity's problems. The responsibility of clarity is more modest, but also more sustainable. It involves contributing your unique perspective to collective conversations, challenging assumptions that need to be questioned, and creating alternatives to thinking that has become rigid or outdated. This might manifest as writing that helps others think more clearly about important topics. It might involve teaching or mentoring that helps develop intellectual courage in others. It might mean participating in organizations or movements where your perspective can make a constructive difference. The key is finding ways to contribute that match your particular strengths and circumstances, while also recognizing the limits of what any individual can accomplish. Nietzsche demonstrated this balance in his own work. He took his philosophical responsibilities seriously and worked tirelessly to develop and express his ideas clearly. But he also recognized that he was one voice among many, and that the impact of his work would depend on how others received and built upon his insights. Conclusion. The courage to see the psychology of dangerous thinkers as Nietzsche understood it isn't ultimately about being different or special. It's about developing the courage to see clearly and the wisdom to use that clarity constructively. This courage is available to anyone willing to cultivate it. It doesn't require exceptional intelligence or special talents. It requires the willingness to question your own assumptions, the emotional strength to face uncomfortable truths, and the moral courage to express those truths when doing so serves a constructive purpose. But it also requires the humility to recognize that seeing clearly is only the beginning. What matters is what you do with that clarity, how you use it to contribute to your own growth and to the well-being of others. Marcus, in our opening example, faced a choice that dangerous thinkers encounter regularly. He could remain silent and maintain social harmony, or he could speak up and risk isolation. Neither choice is inherently right or wrong. The appropriate response depends on the specific situation and the potential consequences of each option. But what makes someone a dangerous thinker, in Nietzsche's sense, is the capacity to make this choice consciously rather than automatically. Dangerous thinkers develop the self-awareness to recognize when they're seeing something important that others are missing, and the judgment to decide how to respond constructively. This is ultimately what Nietzsche meant by the privilege of owning yourself. Dangerous thinkers own their thoughts, their judgments, and their responses. They don't simply react to social pressure or follow conventional wisdom. They develop the internal strength necessary to think independently and the external skills necessary to express that thinking effectively. The world needs people who can think this way, not because dangerous thinkers are superior to others, but because the challenges facing humanity require all the intellectual resources we can muster. Complex problems require diverse perspectives, creative solutions, and the courage to question assumptions that might be preventing progress. If you recognize yourself in this description of dangerous thinking, Nietzsche would encourage you to embrace that identity while also accepting the responsibilities that come with it. Use your capacity for independent thinking in service of something larger than yourself. Find communities where your perspective is valued. Develop the skills necessary to express your insights constructively. And remember that the goal isn't to be different for its own sake, but to contribute to collective understanding in whatever ways you can. The courage to see clearly is only valuable if it leads to the wisdom to act constructively on what you see. This is the psychology of dangerous thinkers, not a psychology of superiority or isolation, but a psychology of intellectual courage and constructive contribution. It's the psychology of those who choose the discomfort of truth over the comfort of illusion, and who use that choice to make the world a little bit clearer for themselves and others. In a time when humanity faces unprecedented challenges, we need all the dangerous thinking we can get. But we need dangerous thinking that is tempered with wisdom, guided by ethics, and directed toward constructive ends. We need thinkers who are dangerous to complacency and ignorance, but committed to truth and human flourishing. That is the kind of dangerous thinking Nietzsche advocated, and it remains as relevant today as it was in his time. The courage to see clearly will always be needed, and those who develop this courage will always play an essential role in human progress. The question isn't whether dangerous thinking is good or bad. It's whether you're willing to develop the courage to see clearly and the wisdom to use that clarity well. That is the challenge, and the opportunity that Nietzsche identified, and it remains available to anyone willing to embrace it.